So, you've decided to watch a Kimble Justice video. May I congratulate you on your good taste and all that bollocks. Now, I'm sure that some of you out there are familiar with games, or at least versions of games, such as this. They're famous games, but not as you know them. They're all PC ports, and they're all quite staggeringly awful. Could anyone possibly be happy with games like this? Most of us look at them every now and again so we can have a good laugh. Of course, these games were all made back in the 1980s, when PCs were used for spreadsheets, word processors, and very little else. Not many people had PCs in the home, and whatever time was spent at the office sneaking away some gaming was usually spent on Sierra adventure games and the like, not on games that you could easily play on a console at home, away from the wandering eyes of your boss. But it got me thinking. What about arcade and console ports on the UK's very finest computer, the Commodore Amiga? The Amiga was cheaper, more gaming oriented, and perhaps a bit better equipped for such ports than the PC was, at least back then before people truly grasped the PC's power. So let's have a look at some Amiga ports, eh? All of these games are classics that most of you surely know, but not a lot of you will know them like this. So get ready for an Amiga class education, as we see just how this venerable system coped with these arcade gems. Some of them are good, and some of them are, well, you'll see. They're interesting. Let's do it. Right, let's begin the show with some beat-em-ups. And what better place to start than the game that set it all off? Good old Double Dragon. Being a pretty successful arcade game, it got ported virtually everywhere, so the existence of this port is hardly surprising. Hell, I remember owning a Spectrum version of the game way back in the day. It was terrible. So you can picture my disappointment when I saw that the same guys responsible for that, Melbourne House, were behind the Amiga port as well. This port's a neat way to start, as it's an example of a few general problems with Amiga ports that we'll be running into as we go along. Firstly, most Amiga games were only programmed for one button. A lot of joysticks only had one button, a carryover from the C64 days. As games get more complex, the single button presents more and more problems. It doesn't help the controls here, that's for sure. To do a flying kick, you have to press down and attack. That's the level we're at here. Secondly, the presentation's seriously lacking a lot of the time, particularly orally. A lot of Amiga games didn't do music and SFX at the same time, you see. So all the music you get in this port is a quite awful sampled version of the Stage 1 theme at the title screen. That's it. It's just muffled punches, yelps and puking for the rest of the game. The trouble with this Double Dragon is that it's just so monotonous. The AI usually does more than just charge forward at you in games like this, don't they? Well, that's all they do here, meaning you can just kick them to death, which takes frickin' ages. It doesn't help that most of the enemies are simply palette swaps of Billy anyway. You won't find much individuality here. It's just not a fun game at all. Aside from the legendarily awful random timing part in the last stage, I had no trouble with it. It's pretty bad and deadly boring. Hopefully the next beat-em-up will be better. Ah, for fuck's sake, here we go. Anyway, Battletoads. A game I don't really have any sort of connection with at all, but it's certainly one of the most loved beat-em-ups of its day, particularly on the NES. I didn't even know the game came to the Amiga, but hey, there it is. The pumping music and the introduction might give you a little bit of hope here. Surely this game's better than Double Dragon, it can't possibly fail. And then you actually play it. That music suddenly disappears, and all you're left with is one of the most uncontrollable and unfun beat-em-ups I have ever seen. Here's the deal. As is so often the case, as I just mentioned, you only have one button, and I have never seen a game that needed to use the second button as much as this one did. If you're standing, you attack. If you're moving, you jump. That's how this game works. Now, I've seen some nonsensical control schemes in my time, but, well, this one might top them all. I don't get it. Although most Amiga games were only programmed for one button, and that's fair enough, the option to program for a second was there, and this game doesn't use it. That just goes beyond incompetence, frankly. I need a new word to describe this sort of idiocy. And that's not all. It's also less responsive than a tortoise on frickin' laudanum. And it's as janky as all get out. Truth be told, the game's clearly unfinished. It was clearly never any more than a total wreck at any stage during its production. It's a game where you stand still, wait for enemies to come to you, and then hit them, lest you trigger the moon physics jump by mistake. What's not to love? Yeah, no wonder it got 9% from Amiga Power. It might just be the worst game in the whole episode. I say might, honestly I'm not sure yet. Jesus, we're already 0 for 2 in a big way. Let's redress the balance a little. I mean, surely Final Fight can't fail, can it? It's simple enough. Hell, the arcade game practically uses little more than a single button as it is. You can't screw this up. And indeed they don't. Final Fight is an example of an Amiga conversion that's not bad at all. Even US Gold couldn't botch this up. Again, certain things are lacking, no in-game music, but, well, that's common. Just grab yourself a record, something that you reckon's suitable for this sort of action. Once you've done that, you'll be greeted by a pretty good arcade port. Yes, it's not as smooth, yes, it's not as colourful, but it's still very much Final Fight. All the enemies are present and correct, the sprites are suitably big, and it's got exactly what made the game popular in the first place. It's fast and furious. Before Final Fight, it always seemed to take a bloody eternity to beat bad guys in these games. And Final Fight changed that, and the Amiga version doesn't screw with it. It even uses the single button sensibly, which is a real breath of fresh air. Plus, it's got multiplayer, which frankly puts it ahead of the SNES port as far as I'm concerned. Overall, this is a very decent port, and it's one of the better games we'll see in this video. Okay, time to move on. The beat-em-ups proved to be a rough ride, but I think we found something decent in the end. Final Fight isn't the only one either. The Amiga version of Golden Axe is actually quite decent as well, if you like that sort of thing. And the subject of Golden Axe moves me neatly along to my next fight. Let's do some Sega races, shall we? Question: what is Kimble's all-time favourite racing game? Answer: OutRun. No contest. You should know that. It's a bloody masterpiece, so it is. Loving the game can be dangerous, of course. The port's got very high standards to live up to, and this is quite an early Amiga game. Around about 1988, I believe. Also, it's by US Gold, who had a rather colourful history with the OutRun name, producing games like Battle OutRun and OutRun Europa that were, well, not exactly in keeping with the standards of the franchise. So perhaps I should lower my expectations a little. Okay, expectations lowered. And it's still rubbish. The game's still kinda fast, but it's way too juddery. It almost reminds me of a Spectrum game in that regard, and every frame is just it's like a Trogs drum beat. This makes it somewhat difficult to figure out just where you're going and avoid all the traffic. The music and SFX are together at least, but on the whole this is just a dog. More than that, it's a dog that was clearly ported directly from the Atari ST, another problem that a lot of early Amiga games had. In short, this game is an outsider. It doesn't belong here. Get rid of it. So do you want an Amiga conversion of a Sega arcade racing game released early on in the system's life that's actually quite good? If so, then have I got the game for you. Here's Super Hang-On. Coded by the wonderfully named Zoe ZK Zohannes, a bit of a bright spark when it came to Amiga racers, this is the prime example of how you port a classic racer to the Amiga. Just look at how much smoother this game is. Listen to the engine note. The music's there too, and it's bloody good. Super Hannon has got everything you could possibly want. Hell, I would even go as far to say that it's nearly as good as the Mega Drive version. It's an absolute gem of a port, easily the best game in this video, and it shows what happens when you actually let a decent coder take the reins. You can even play it with your mouse, which is, well, quite an interesting way of playing it. It actually sort of works. I'm not sure if it would work anywhere else, but this is just bloody good. Highly, highly recommended. But methinks it's time to move on to some other games that I fancy won't be as successful. It's time to drive away from Sega World and go headlong into Nintendo Land. Now, I didn't expect to find much in the way of the big N on the Amiga, and indeed, I didn't. But I did find a couple of intriguing test subjects, both originally released by Konami. So, the Amiga got a port of Castlevania, something that wasn't even an arcade game originally. It also happens to be one of my all-time favourite games, so I'm intrigued to see how it turns out. The main positives actually lie for once in the presentation. The original music's here in Amiga chiptune form, and it isn't bad at all. The title screen even features a rather odd, completely original track. Strange, but hey, a bit of a curio for fans. The graphics aren't too bad, although some of the enemies do look rather odd. The zombies and Medusa heads in particular make me really scratch my head. However, the game really falls down, as usual, in the controls department. The killer is the sub-weapons. When you hit the button, it seems wholly random as to whether you use the whip or use your sub. You can't predict it. If you've got a sub-weapon like the axe, well, that can be rather annoying when you unintentionally throw that and it arcs over whatever's in front of you. There's cheap hits all over the place, and it only makes a hard game even harder. The knife and the crucifix are basically the only useful sub-weapons, seeing as you throw them straight in front of you, but frankly I would just avoid sub-weapons altogether if you want to get anywhere in this game. Other problems like dodgy hit detection and generally sluggish response times ultimately kill this game. It's just not a good port, not nice to play, and it doesn't really belong on this system. It may well be the king of all action games, but here on the Amiga, it's barely more than chicken scratch. Alas. And it's not the only Konami classic that saw a release on the Amiga. Yep, the Amiga got a Contra game. Weirdly enough, it's not the original, it's Super C. Oh, well, doesn't bother me. I prefer this one to the original as it goes. It's a bloody brilliant sequel. Didn't expect to see it here on the Amiga though, but here's the funny thing. Assuming that this game came out in Europe, it's the only occasion in the 8-16-bit era that Contra was referred to as Contra. In Europe anyway. The original arcade game was called Gryzor over here, and the NES version was called Probotector. Not only that, the game was reskinned and you controlled robots instead of bare-chested yanks. And did you know that Gryzor was released for the Spectrum, meaning that you can actually play this iconic 8-bit NES classic on the Black Beauty? I mean, I imagine it's atrocious, but it's still there. That's pretty cool. I can't do it anymore. Yes, I'm filling up time. You can just look at these visuals and see for yourself what this game's like. It's drab and colourless and a complete misery to play. Here's how this game's broken. You can only jump when you're standing still, meaning that you'll have to move in midair if you want to cover any distance. Fun, eh? Alas, this is not a good port in any way, shape or form. The controls are just completely and utterly worn. It looks like a public domain game, and even the port of Castlevania puts this one to shame. There was no shortage of decent action games on the Amiga, by the way. If you picked up this game instead of frickin' Turrican, then you needed your head examined. Or kicked in. Or both. Oh, by the way, I checked. This game was released in America only and never even made it to Europe, meaning that its scope was limited purely to the 10 or 12 people who happened to own Amigas in the States. Did I know this already? Yes, I did. That whole bit at the start was solely put there for the purpose of wasting your time. Well, now you know how it feels, don't you? Ha 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 ha. Okay, there's just one more game to cover. We've sucked sidewalk, rode over granite, jumped over no end of pits, but now it's time to go right down to the cobblestones and do a fighting game. Now, if only there was some incredibly famous fighting game that was ported to virtually everywhere, including the Amiga, that I could cover. Yep, had to be. I could have done the original Street Fighter, but, well, that game's awful anyhow, so we wouldn't learn much from a crap port. I could have done Mortal Kombat, but I wanted a port I wasn't already familiar with. MK's not bad, by the way. And I could have certainly done plain old vanilla Street Fighter 2, but, well, why not aim a little bit higher? Here's Super Street Fighter 2, the king of the arcades. It's little wonder that the premium home versions of this game were found on the PC and the 3DO. Compared to them, the Amiga was a mere flyweight, particularly in 1994. Besides, you would be forgiven for thinking that the Amiga, with its lack of buttons and all, would be pretty terrible at fighting games. Look at how shite the Mega Drive was with 3. However, that wasn't the case. There are some very decent fighting games on the system. Body Blows and Shadow Fighter are a hell of a lot of fun, and were designed to work with the Amiga's controls to a T. So even if SSF2 was the best fighter going at the time, this port wasn't necessarily going to be the best fighter on the system. For a start, how on earth do you get all those moves on 1 or 2 buttons without cheating and leaving any of them out? That was US Gold's problem, and to be fair, they really did try on this one, but in the end, it's not exactly brilliant. The trouble with this game is that how much you enjoyed it depended so much on what kit you had. If you didn't have a hard disk to put the game on, you were faced with the prospect of swapping 7 floppy disks. Sometimes 5 minutes can pass between matches. There's loading for everything, even the frickin' win quote. Let's run through the access time. You load up the character select screen, start up a fight, and then you have to swap a disc for your character, then swap in another for who you're facing, win or lose the fight, load the win quote, possibly load the continue screen, and just repeat that over and over. God help you if you change characters. You'll feel like doing what Ryu's doing there before too long, believe me. There's a wide variety of control options now. If you had a 6-button CD32 pad kicking around, you were laughing. This version was golden. But of course, nobody bought the CD32, and most people still had 1-button joysticks. In the end, SSF2 has so many moves that it's simply too much for a 1-button pad to take. With 1 button, the moves have to be context sensitive, meaning you're never entirely sure what you're going to throw. That and you had to press a button on the keyboard to switch between punches and kicks. Pretty awkward, especially for 2 players. There is a 2-button option that works quite well. It's not perfect, but it makes the action a great deal more fluid. Once again though, you need that kit. One wonders why some of these games didn't use a keyboard option, to be honest. The graphics were also quite disappointing here. Everything's shoved into a letterbox and all the sprites become way too small. You see a lot more of the play area, but yeah, this doesn't look an awful lot like Street Fighter. Despite all of this though, it's clearly a very good conversion. The AI is absolutely spot on. You know how all these characters play, Guile's turtling, Zangief's relentless throws, that never-ending tiger 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 mantra? It's all there. If you have 6 buttons or even 2, those controls are absolutely fine. They're responsive and sensibly laid out. It's also worth noting that this game runs at a very solid and consistent 50 frames. It's as fast as the arcade, and very few games in this video can match that. The game may not look or sound like Street Fighter, but it does feel like Street Fighter, and that's the important thing. Still, again, you needed the kit. For the more casual Amiga user, the game's a struggle. On the whole, well, it's there, and it certainly casts an impressive shadow, but it's perhaps a bit too ambitious in the end. It's arguably the best it could have been, but original games like Shadow Fighter, while not as flashy and certainly not as famous, just sit better on the system. So what have we learned from all these games? I suppose the main thing we can take from them is that it's not really fair to say that a system's bad at ports on the whole. Just because games like OutRun and Double Dragon exist doesn't mean that the Amiga was shite at bringing the arcade experience home. Games like Super Hang-On and Final Fight show what happens when you get a decent coder on the job. As Ronnie Bond of the Trogs used to say, you gotta put some fucking fairy dust over the bastard. Some ports can be truly spectacular, moments when a system punches way above their weight. Even the Specky had a tremendous version of Chase HQ. But the trouble with these ports is that 9 times out of 10, the required effort didn't go into them. The software houses usually saw them as quick and easy ways of making a buck. Usually only 1 or 2 people were working on them, so the turnaround was pretty fast, and, well, let's face it, a lot of these coders probably weren't amongst the A-listers of the programming world. They were young upstarts looking for an opportunity, and companies would give it to them, so long as they could meet the deadline no matter what. Just get that shit out. That was the business model anyhow. Get it out, and after disappointing everyone, simply move on to the next one. There'll always be some completely naive idiot out there who just thinks that this time things might just be different. US Gold, Ocean, that was the way they did things. Hurried ports and even more hurried movie tie-ins. But every now and again something good would come from the mire, and we would all pounce on it like it was a rich tourist walking through a crack den. These were the days when perfect arcade ports were a distant dream, and we would take whatever we could get. If a game managed to nail the feel of an arcade original, well, that was enough. As time went on, the ports got better and better, even on the PC. Things improved dramatically once publishers stopped spending about 49p on all their PC conversions. But something about a really old arcade conversion bristles with nostalgia, even the terrible ones. It makes you remember the times when you made the best of what you had. It's like, I don't know, buying a pot noodle. Something you may or may not have eaten in your childhood and probably haven't eaten in 15 years. It's all about the memory. Whether it tastes nice or not is another matter entirely. And with that said, it's time to end the video. So thanks for watching, and wherever you are, whoever you be, have a good one, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!